Okay, these are our Chapter 13 notes. Chapter 13 is about measuring the economy, as you can see right there. We measure lots of things, of course. We measure the temperature, right? Weather, we measure in cooking. In a school setting, I feel like one of the main ways we measure anything is, is Johnny smart or not? And think about that, like in your classes before when you got to physically come to a school, and you sat down and kids were next to you and you said, hey, is this kid smart? When Harvard decides, are they going to admit you or not, right? In part, really, it's a decision of we're going to let Johnny in if he is smart enough. Based on what, right? So do you think Johnny is smart enough? What makes the Harvard admission officer decide that? So what are the main ways we, as a society in school settings primarily anyway, say, hey, are you smart enough? So I feel like, if you're thinking about that question and coming up with an answer, it's most likely standardized tests, ACT, SAT, that stuff, right? Or grades, GPA, how'd you do, right? Do you know anyone who got like great grades and terrible ACT scores? What about the opposite, right? Rocked the SAT and the GPA is terrible. So, in which conditions is Johnny smart under those? Yeah. Anyway, so just keep that in the back of your mind and sort of think about different notions of measurement as we go through these chapter 13 notes here real quickly. The first part of them anyway. So, okay, so in an economic sense, right, let's measure the economy. How is the economy doing? So a subject of many Thanksgiving table discussions, right? So your uncle thinks the economy is wonderful and your aunt thinks it's terrible. Well, who's right? How can they both have that sense, right? We don't ever really argue much anyway about the weather, right? If it's raining, it's raining. So why is the economy different? Well, there is one chief way that economists tend to agree on as the chief measurement of the economy, and that's called gross domestic product, or GDP, as we see here on the slide, right? So GDP is gross domestic product. Gross simply means total, everything taken together. Domestic means at home. In this case, we'll talk about the United States, but every country or state or city or has its own GDP. And then product is literally just how much stuff you make, right? So anyway, the total value of all final goods and services produced in a nation in a single year, fancy textbook definition, and all that fancy, goods and services, chapter 1 stuff. Do you remember that? Tangible, intangible. Everything a country makes in a year, right? Aircraft carriers, horseradish roots, ties, coffee mugs, doesn't matter. Anything you create in a country in a year. And the easy thing to think about is goods, tangible objects, right? But also services, very importantly. So services, the legal fees, the architect drawings, the brain surgeon, when she, cut open the patient and fixed the brain and sewed it back up and you walked out there great. Wow. That's part of our GDP, right? That should be a service that is provided by a surgeon. And how do we calculate all that? Anyway, so everything made, both good and service, in a country in a year. So America has its GDP for 2019. Egypt has its GDP for 2016. Every country, every state, every year that records go back anyway. We have GDP, yeah? Okay, final is underlined, right? Total value of final goods and services. That's important. Next part of that slide, of course, indicates that. Final avoids double counting. Huh? Okay, so if you're a tire factory in Ohio and you create 4 tires and each tire is worth $100, well, that should be $400 of American GDP, right? You made 4 things. But let's say that Goodyear tire factory in Akron, Ohio, sells those tires to Ford Motor Company, who puts them on a car in Detroit, Michigan that rolls off the assembly line and gets sold for $30,000 total. So if I counted those 4 tires at $100 each when they came off the tire assembly line in Ohio, and then I also count $30,000 towards America's GDP when that car rolls off the assembly line in Detroit, well, I've really counted those tires twice, right? So if I count the wheat in the farmer's field and then I also count the loaf of bread sold at Schnucks, I've double counted that wheat. So it's a complicated process, right? But that's what it means by final. We don't want to count things twice, or 3 or 100 times. So you wait till the very end product, good or service, so the car and the loaf of bread, whatever, the horseradish sauce, not the individual horseradish roots, and you count that up, right? So it's an incredibly complicated calculation, right? I mean, if you try to imagine how that would occur, it's mind blowing, I think, right? So anyway, GDP is definitely only a best estimate of a nation's total economic production. It's really impossible to get anything exact. But economists have basically said, look, this is as good as it'll ever get. It is a best estimate, but it's a best estimate, right? So it's at least useful in comparing countries to each other or a country over time or whatever. So this is what it looks like when you think about sort of the annual time frame comparison of GDP, right? So this is U.S. GDP growth YOY, which means year over year. But anyway, just a time frame comparison. So wherever it's red, it means our economy shrunk. So let's say your economy literally made just those 4 tires and nothing else, right? It took an entire year and your whole society made 4 tires. You have a 4-tire economy. And let's say each one of those tires was $100. So obviously $400 is your GDP, is your economy. Well, let's say the next year, one of you got sick or whatever, broke a leg, and you could only make 3 tires. So in year 2, I declined from a 4-tire or $400 economy to a 3-tire $300 economy. My economy shrunk 25%, right? 1/4 down. So this image here goes back to the 1930s. Lots of red. Our total economy shrunk dramatically. We made lots less stuff from 31 to 32, and even more from 32 to 33, and so on. Gee, what were the 1930s? All you history majors out there, right? So the Great Depression, and then we actually bounced back in the late 30s, which doesn't get talked about all that much. But anyway, and then sort of we sink back into depression, and we never recovered here as well as here. Anyway, so 30s terrible economically speaking, right? And then incredible growth here in the early 40s. And what's going on in the early 40s? Hey, World War II. So the United States government spends a lot of money to get us out of the depression by winning a war, right? So we spent lots of money building tanks and aircraft carriers. Anyway, so then you can see over time in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, American growth by GDP tends to go up. It tends to go up on average about 3% for most of that sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s time frame. And then the last 2 decades, we've also had mostly economic growth, but slower. And then the greatest economic catastrophe before COVID, thanks COVID, was the Great Recession of 2009. And that's this sort of collapsing red line right here. Anyway, so that's what US GDP looks like over time. And then 2008, right? We have GDP comparison by country. So this is just a year old statistically speaking, because we don't have 2020 numbers, obviously. But anyway, 2018 shows us the country's total GDP. The United States made $20.5 trillion worth of stuff total. Every horseradish root, wherever it ended up, is a final good or service, right? Every architect's plans, every aircraft carrier that the government commissioned, and so on. Anyway, everything made in the United States, final good and service in 2018, best estimate anyway, all added together was 20.5 trillion bucks. That's way bigger than China's 13 trillion. I think a lot of people wouldn't have guessed that necessarily. China, I think is where we think everything is made. So it's good to have that in mind, right? But China dwarfs then, right? Japan and Germany and the United Kingdom, who come in 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Mexico and Canada with less than $2 trillion economies are still definitely significant in terms of the world, but 1/20th the size of the U.S. economy and so on. Anyway, so that's just little points of comparison to think about. Okay, so there are other ways we measure whether Johnny's smart, right? So the Harvard admissions officer may just want to look first at the SAT score or maybe the GPA. But hey, then we want to say, did you, know how to fence or ride horses or play tennis or, what else did you do that is worthy of, my determination of, are you smart? So anyway, so just some other measurements we can use. So national income, or NI, is a frequent one economists will look to, just the total income earned by everyone in a country in a year. And then I care more about my disposable personal income than my share of the national income. Disposable personal income just means what you have left after taxes. So if I make $50,000 a year, but they take $20,000 from me in taxes, I really only make $30,000, right? That I have to spend on rent and food and whatever it is. So anyway, DPI is really just NI minus taxes. Gets you disposable personal income. So if those numbers are going up, right, it tends to show an economy growing. We tend to make more money from the places that hire us are making more money. So it's similar to GDP in that sense, but not always. Anyway, all of these things we've talked about, GDP, national income, right, my raise, tax money, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, all of it's measured in dollars. Now in England, they measure it in pounds, right, which we can convert to dollars and so on. Anyway, you have to find a currency, and the US dollar is the main one. We'll only talk about that, and here in the US, it's all we use. But anyway, let's say that we go back to that economy that had a 4-tire economy, and each of those tires was worth $100, right? So this year we lived in a $400 GDP economy. And next year, thankfully, no one got sick, no one broke a leg, right? And we make 4 tires again. But we're able to sell those tires to that, society across the street or whatever for $120 each. So now the price went up, right? From 4 $100 tires, $400 to $420 tires. And so if I'm calculating this just in dollar terms, that's 120, 240, 360, 480. I'm a $480 economy. Man, it looks like my economy grew a lot from $400 to $480. Fantastic. But it's sort of an illusion, right? Like what matters is my economy could create 4 tires in year 1 and 4 tires in year 2. We are not more productive. We're not making more stuff. It is just a product of prices going up that our economy looks like we're growing. So that's called inflation, right? It's just prices go up. And if prices go up and I make the same, my purchasing power, how much I can buy, goes down. So we talked about real income effect way back in an earlier chapter, right? Chapter 7, supply and demand stuff. So anyway, that's what inflation does, right? It erodes our purchasing power. And we have to think about that in terms of real income effect. Economists care about this. I'm going to go back a slide. I'm going to try to go back a slide. Economists care about this when we think about these statistics, right? So stuff cost a dramatically different amount of money in the 1960s than today. So how on earth are we comparing a $1 trillion economy in 1962 to a $20 trillion economy today when so much of that is really just based on inflation? The prices increase dramatically, right? So you tend to measure stuff and you pick a base year and you say, okay, all our dollars are based in 2020 dollars. So we'll take out inflation mathematically. Was inflation 3% this year, 2% this year, 5% this year? Let's figure out mathematically how to get rid of inflation, the percentage change just of how much increase in cost occurred. To figure out that a $1 trillion economy back in 1960 was really a $10 trillion economy in today's dollars. So our economy has doubled in size since 1960, say. Those are all hypothetical numbers. I'm making stuff up. But anyway, that's why inflation matters a lot in these measurements of the economy. Oh my God, I fell down. I made it. I know you're worried. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to just move on real quickly because that leads us to, gee, how do we measure inflation, right? And so we have 2 main ways. The CPI is the Consumer Price Index. And I'm going to save that for the next round of notes. But this is important because so it kind of makes sense. Hey, let's figure out inflation. But how? Like, how do I factor out 5% this year, 3% that year? How do I know what inflation was? So next time we pick up these notes,